Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Twice as Hard. I'm Janelle Benjamin, founder and CEO of All Things Equitable, and I'm here today with the lovely Selam Debs. I am really pleased to have her with me. She is an anti-racism educator, and she owns her own yoga studio. Amazing practitioner who's here to share a bunch of insights on this amazing topic that we have going right now, and it's all about how to create safer workplaces for Black women in particular. So welcome, Selam. Thanks for being a guest.
Thank you, Janelle. It's a pleasure and honor to be here.
So Selam, let's just start by talking about this notion that we have about Black women working twice as hard. I'm sure there's a lot of viewers who are probably saying, okay, yeah, right, well, like, we all work hard. Like, why is this a thing for Black women? Why do you think that we need to feature this or highlight this at this time?
Well, I think it's really important to highlight it because, it is systemic and it definitely is intergenerationally passed on. And I believe that it's a survival technique, that there is the difference between surviving and thriving. And when I think about my mother being an Ethiopian, immigrants who immigrated to so-called Canada and had to work 3 or 4 jobs at once. And we lived in the, disinvested communities of Regent Park and Scarborough, and even in Kitchener-Waterloo and Chandler-Moet. And we had, the experiences that we had are not unique. The experience of having to watch my mom have to work 3-4 times as hard in order to just provide some level of stability for us as a family, I really think is rooted in the ways in which we are systemically forced into those conditions, right? So I think that aspect is something that we have to be aware of, so that we're not thinking that these are just natural traits. We're just go-getters. We work so hard. We're workaholics. Black women are, the fastest growing entrepreneurs, or that may be true, but where does it stem from? And I think it's important for us, when we're thinking about equity as a whole, that we examine that to ensure that we're not perpetuating and placing that extra burden on Black women.
Yeah, I like what you said there. It's really critical that it's not an innate characteristic within us that causes us to want to perform and to work our best. Really, it's this ingrained notion that we have, whether it's through, the immigration process, as you've highlighted. My parents were also newcomers to Canada, and, they've instilled that value system in me that I need to work twice as hard, right? Recognizing the disparities that they were clearly able to see, and the fact that they could tell that the treatment they would receive as racialized people was clearly distinct and unique. I think intuitively they knew that this is exactly what is going to be needed for their children, right? For the next generation. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I know that as much as I'm trying to, introduce my 16-year-old son to other ways of being in the world, I've also for sure passed that on to him in many ways. And that I think it's important to understand that that is the way in which I think anti-Black racism really operates, in that us as Black women, we are used to taking on so much of the emotional labor. We are scrutinized in every space that we are in. We are asked to do more than our, white or non-Black, colleagues. And I think when you realize that you have to work that hard in order to, survive, I think it does mean that it does become like a part of the way that you move in the world. Like it feels natural until you start to look at it and you're like, hold on a second. I think about racial battle fatigue, the work that we do. And sometimes when I watch and I talk to Black women and I hear all of us kind of sharing the same thing, I'm tired, I'm exhausted. And we have to realize that thinking is really connected to a larger conversation of, like, the emotional labor, the free labor, the intergenerational trauma, the ways in which Black bodies have been treated through colonialism, through getting access to free labor, through our labor being really deeply connected to our worth. And it's hard to like separate that when that's, you know, kind of what's been passed on in terms of epigenetics and DNA, that we know this, you know, instinctively in our bodies, that we have to work twice as hard.
Oh my God, I'm having like an aha moment, like even in this conversation, just to, you know, think about that legacy of slavery and the fact that, you know, our labor is literally, you know, our value and our worth is actually connected and like you said, passed on through the generations, right? Where we were valued or devalued based on how hard we worked on the plantation. And now here we are, right? As Black women showing up in the world and doing all the things, going above and beyond in order again to prove our worth, to prove our value, to prove our competence, to prove that we're good enough, and still facing so many barriers in the workplace. Talk to me about some of the barriers that you have encountered personally before you became an entrepreneur, but just in general in workspaces in the Greater Toronto area.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think that's probably why I moved into entrepreneurship, because I think prior to that, not having access, like being passed on that legacy of having to, you know, work twice as hard and not having access to, for example, you know, education in the way some of my friends and people that I grew up with, in the ways in which I would come into spaces and not be believed, you know, be questioned, that it was constantly, people were more focused on the way that I spoke. Oh, you're so articulate, than the content of what I was sharing, like the actual information, and the ways in which you're kind of, you know, pinholed into a specific way of being in the world, that if you don't assimilate, if you don't talk a certain way, if you don't act a certain way, that the chances of you being able to move up are low. And if you're talking about equity, I found in the workspace, then you definitely were not going to be moving up. That definitely was a barrier. And so you learned how to kind of navigate these spaces in a way where you made yourself smaller. I think that was the experience I had a lot, where I felt like I couldn't be fully myself. And that I couldn't be fully myself, and that I really wasn't able to find upward mobility, that it didn't matter, that working within these systems, I wasn't able to get to the place that I wanted to. And so for me, you know, entrepreneurship was that way of being able to establish myself out of those boundaries. And I still face them, because I work with companies and organizations and institutions where I have to be very hyper vigilant about, like, these are the expectations. This is what you can expect from me. This is what I expect from you. Because otherwise, those patterns play out immediately, and they treat me in a way in which, you know, you're the token Black woman, or you're going to just educate us, or you know, the ways in which they don't see you as a expert or an authority, and you're constantly proving yourself in those spaces. So I think I've learned to, you know, I always laugh and make jokes about the fact that my guiding principles, or the expectations that I bring into you know, working with organizations or companies, it's like it gets longer and longer and longer. I keep adding more stipulations, like, so this is another way that we're not going to harm Black women in this space. And I feel like it just keeps adding, because the more experiences I have in these spaces as, you know, an authority or a person that's supposed to be educating and leading, the more I have to teach people how to treat me.
Give us a few examples, you know, for people who are wondering, okay, what should we not do to Black women?
There's too many. Janelle, we need like hours, but
I know I have my boundaries, and I set them out in my policies, like upfront when I send my guidelines to the clients. But I just, you know, I'm sure the viewers are like, okay, well, tell us more. Like, what do we not need to do? You know, we've got lots of white viewers in corporate spaces for sure. And they're, you know, watching this series and hoping to learn the best practices in dealing with Black women in the workplace. And so what would you say are maybe like the top 3 things that they should absolutely not do?
Well, I think what I see often is the ways in which, we're tokenized, for example, in the workspace, where they hire us on to say, we want to do this anti-racism work, we want to do equity work, DI work. But really what they've brought you on to do is to kind of placate and to check the box and be performative in that, look, we have a consultant that's come in and we are integrating an anti-racism statement and we're doing these interviews and we're putting together this course, but they're not willing to have the difficult conversations. And so, placing Black women in the situation where we're constantly having to really fight for the reason why we're supposed to be there, which is really Black dignity and Black safety and Black well-being. So I think that's one aspect, is really stating up front, that if we're here to do this work, that we are going to be talking about difficult subjects like white supremacy, that we are going to be talking about whiteness in the workplace, and we want to integrate accountability in that way. I would say that that's one big way. I think the other way is, the urgency, the expectations of us to kind of jump through hoops to all of a sudden become their equity leader for everything and to do all the things for them where they're not having to do the work. I think utilizing us and trying to find ways to cut corners with pricing and time and energy. It's like, oh, let's just do this extra projects over here. And it's like, but that wasn't part of the contract. So perpetuating anti-Black racism in the work of dismantling anti-Black racism.
So for me, it comes down to, if I could just summarize what your 2 points were. Number one, don't be performative, right? If you're watching this, no performative work in the workplace. If you're sincere and genuine about DEI and anti-racism work, let's do the work. And then number two, don't exploit us, right? Exploiting our labor is definitely a no-no. And we feel exploited when, you're asking us to do this and that and other things that we didn't actually agree on upfront. And it plays out certainly in the entrepreneurial context, but it plays out in the workplace as well, where, we're called in, to let's just plan, this event, like just use Black History Month, for example, plan all the Black History Month events for the workplace, but you're not being conscious of the ways in which you're exploiting your Black staff's time, resources, energy, and taking them away from other things that they may want to actually be doing. And then, sort of you're tokenizing them for this one task, and then all the other months of the year, you've forgotten that they exist in your organization, and that they also have things that they can contribute that go beyond or outside of the scope of that one little task that you've just tokenized them for.
Absolutely. And I would say the last one would be, Janelle, there's so many, but one that I think is really important is the ways in which often white folks will, play the victim within the scenario. So we see white tears, or we see folks, attempting in, executive positions, attempting to, prove the fact that they are not that racist white person, or they're better than the others. And I think it places us in a position where we are positioned as the aggressor, and when we are naming things, or we're calling them out, or we're calling them in, or providing feedback. And I think that toxic, workplace kind of environment or relationship is, the perpetuating and the weaponizing of white tears and white fragility, which is really white violence, because it's not fragile at all.
No, it's absolutely. And, you and I both know very well that racism is violence, and it's violence perpetuated in so many different forms. And I'm really curious, just, as we speak about this, around, a horrible situation that you went through recently, where, the convoy and members of the white supremacist hate groups attacked you personally. Do you want to share your story about these violent messages and interactions that you've had?
Yeah. So basically, what happened is, like, as an anti-racism educator, I speak on, white supremacy. I've been talking about the impacts and the disparities within the pandemic. Throughout the whole pandemic, I've talked about it very openly. And, recently I spoke about the connection between the, quote unquote, freedom convoy and the relationship to white nationalism and white rage and privilege and so forth. And, what happened was that these groups that are forming, because we know that white nationalist groups are increasing by over 300%, they, targeted me in a very specific way, and other Black women also doing this work. And, really started sending me hundreds, if not thousands in total, hateful, violent messages, threatening my life, threatening my business, threatening, my well-being. And so, we had to go through this whole process of trying to make everything as private as possible. We had to, work with authorities, with police, and work within that system to try to get accountability. And we had to close the reopening of our studio, my yoga studio, in order to maintain the safety. And since then, there's been other changes that have had to happen. I've had to remove the yoga studio decal on my car that promotes Juicy Yoga to create more privacy and safety, as well as tinting my car. And so, it's under investigation, it's happening, but I think, I think it's important for folks to understand that, like, that experience of, white violence and of, right-wing extremist groups and what's happening. I know a lot of people that talked about the convoy and spoke about it very explicitly, about its connections of seeing the Nazi symbols and seeing the swastikas and the Confederate flag. But of course, Black women, especially Black women in doing this work, and the way that we name it very explicitly, were attacked.
Yeah, I will share that, when I saw the messages directed at you personally, it literally, it arose an anger, like a righteous anger within me. And it wasn't until much later, maybe a couple of weeks later, that as I was processing what those messages entailed, that it brought me to tears. And I'm getting even emotional thinking about it. Just the message of violence directed at your Black body, at your Black womanhood, and particularly, there was a threat to cut your locks that really resonated, as someone who, my mother had dreadlocks, and she cut them off. And I understand what the symbolism means, or when we do take, when we take that action to cut off our hair. And I think that the person who sent you that message knew that as well. And they knew, by saying that, the violence that they were enacting on you. And it was so hurtful, and it was so vile. And I feel overwhelmed when I think about doing this work in a world in which we live with these so-called humans, right? Like, we live among these people and we walk alongside them every day. And this morning I was also, I would say, attacked by white supremacists at a traffic light. And honestly, I had just dropped my son off to school. I was minding my business. I turned a corner, past a crossing guard. He had just finished bringing some children back across the street. And as I got to the next traffic light, he pulled up alongside me on the left-hand lane and put the window down. He's in a blue pickup truck. And I thought, okay, he must want something, because he popped the horn. So I looked across and I thought he wanted directions. I thought he, trying to be helpful. I put my window down and he says, that crossing guard back there had his stop sign up. And I thought, I said, oh, okay. And he said, oh, so you don't care? I said, well, I'm sorry. Like, if I didn't see, I didn't see. Like, what are you, the moral majority? Like, go on about your day. Like, look, I can't undo the fact that I just went past. So of course he hurls, a racist slur. And as the light goes green, he cuts in front of me back to the right hand lane, and we're in a single file lane, and then just, continues on. But then he's pressing his brakes and his gas, and he's doing all that. But I literally just turned to him and I was like, have a good day, buddy. Like, you're attacking me for, like, swinging past the crossing guard. Like, it's not even 9 o'clock in the morning. What are you so angry about? Like, have a good day, And he's like, what, you don't care? It's like, have a good day. Like, see you later. And then of course there has to be this, aggression and the N-word hurled at me. And I just feel, in so many ways, we do this work, we want to change hearts and minds. But I don't know if we can help everyone. And that's disheartening for me. to know that there potentially are some people that we just will have to leave behind. What do you think about that?
Oh, first, I just want to say I'm so sorry that you went through that, Janelle.
Thank you.
I feel like what the story that you just shared, and even, what happened to me and so many other Black women, and in particular, is like the story of, how our bodies are surveilled, how our bodies, how other groups of people, specifically white folks, feel ownership over our bodies, or feel ownership over our movements,
Yeah.
and our words and who we are. And so that he felt that he could just say that to you in that way so freely, and also felt like he could police you, right?
Yeah.
And in that way. And so,
and terrorized me in a way, because I thought, he said, what, you don't care? So what is he going to do? Is he going to try to make me care? Like, what are you going to be doing in this interaction where you're pressing your brakes and pressing your gas and trying to cause an accident between us? Like, I started to drive really slow so that he could go on, and I really wasn't that agitated. It's like, I thought maybe he has a mental health issue or something. Like, I didn't kill anyone. I didn't hit the crossing guard. I can't undo what happened. Like, let's move forward. And it was, I just thought, okay, here we go with like the male Karens,
and isn't it interesting that we give, for example, like white folks the grace in folks who are super racist, the grace in like maybe they have a mental health disparity, right? But the reality is like there is a culture of white rage, and that's what I was speaking about. And I believe that we can't really move in this work in a truly authentic way. Like when I work with organizations that say we haven't really talked about white supremacy, I say, but don't you know that when we're talking about anti-Black racism, you're not learning about Black people, you're learning about whiteness, right? And if we want to talk about Black people, we know how to do that. We can celebrate, and we have ways in which we unravel our complexities and the ways in which we're not monolith. But when we're talking about anti-Black racism, we're talking about white supremacy. And I think, like, back to your question, which is, are there people that we can't really help? I don't think that we're ever going to be able to really change systems until we address the root of racism, because racism is code for white supremacy, right? And I think it's important for us to really build that, to start, I think about our communities, especially Black communities. We have I saw a workshop recently where they're going to be talking about gangs and talking about drugs in Black communities and the communities I grew up in, and how can we help these youth, move in a different direction. But you don't see the explicit language as to why these communities are disinvested, why these communities are impacted. And then I always make the joke that, the day when we'll know things are changing is when our schools have, and in our organizations have workshops just focus on talking about white rage and white extremism and white fragility in those ways, because of the fact that, this isn't our history. This really isn't our thing to fix. And I think I always go back to the quote of, I forget her name, but during the uprising of 2020 with George Floyd and the uprising of Black Lives Matter again, was, the one woman that said, be grateful that all we're doing is seeking out equity and we're not seeking out revenge.
Yes, that was so profound. I know exactly who you're talking about. Her name is escaping me as well. I'll remember in this conversation, and we'll say her name. But it's such a profound statement that that she made, that we're actually a peaceful people, right? We're trying, even the fact that we do this work to try to fix systems and fix conditions and improve implicit bias and racism and in the individual, in institutions, and in interpersonal interactions, says a lot about who we are as a people, right? That we're the majority of us doing this work, trying to change hearts and minds. And I don't know. I mean, I think the next generation has it a lot, I would say, more figured out in some ways, in a lot of ways. What do you say to your son, who is a teenager, and about what's happening in the world and anti-Black racism, particularly directed at Black boys, and how do you navigate spaces for him as he's about to enter the workforce? Do you talk to him about these things?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think I always make the joke that our dinner tables definitely, politics, equity, social issues, feminism, intersectional feminism. Like we talk about all of the things because, I don't think that we've ever really had the privilege to not. I remember when my son was 4 years old and he came to me and he was like, Mommy, I wish my hair was like my white friends and it was straight. Mommy, I wish you named me Zach instead of Jaleel. Mommy, I wish, my skin was white instead of brown. And so, at that age, I didn't teach him that. I never I never perpetuated anti-Black racism. If anything, I was always trying to help him love himself. But the messaging is so extreme, and it's the water that we drink, it's the air that we breathe. And so I have always had to teach him how to build that sense of self-love, how to understand how to navigate the world, how to, now that he's starting to drive, learning how to drive, there is a fear. I am scared. I wonder, like when I think about the story that you just shared, I think, well, what happens to him when he's in the car and something like that happens? And I worry for him. And so we've always had to have really honest conversations about what it means to be Black and what it means to be a boy, and how he navigates systems and how he navigates, his own identity. And so we're talking about this. So right now he wants to get into film and he wants to go to film school. And so we're always talking about like, how can you make sure that you see yourself? Because there is little representation in terms of directors and editors and virtual effects folks. Like we have to go out of our way, Janelle, to like look for people and find spaces for him to get that, so that when he's designing things or writing things or creating things, that he is not indoctrinated with this idea that he's inferior, that he can like see himself in those stories.
I think that's such an important thing that you just said, because I've worked in a film company and I'm recalling like I was the only Black employee and I was the lowly assistant at the time. Never saw a Black producer, never saw a Black editor, not Black director. All the writers, everybody on staff, they were all white. And for someone like your son to show up in a space like that, he won't be supported unless, you're right, we seek out those places or those spaces that are safe and welcoming, or we create them ourselves, right? Which is, sadly what so many of us are having to do. So maybe one day your son will be a fantastic film studio owner with his,
that's what we say all the time,
create his own studio. I mean, we need it, right? We totally need, we need those spaces for our children and our people to show up and be seen and heard, and know that, and that, we're all okay, and that we can stop these cycles where, we're working twice as hard to get our foot in the door, and then we're met with the barrier. We don't get entry, or we get in or we feel alienated. We don't fit in. We get tokenized. We get marginalized. We, whatever is happening in the space that is not for us, because we're the only one in those spaces.
And I think what I'm trying to do, with him is I want him to understand his inherent worth, right? And trying to pour that into him all again and again. And I just think it's important for folks that are listening to understand that it's a lot of work, like there's a lot of thinking. There's so much that goes into trying to prepare him for the world. That I know my mom did her best at. She did it as like an immigrant woman that was just like, it felt like she was just trying to control me. And it was like, she was angry all the time. But now I look back at it and I know that it was because she was worried for me. She was trying to help me get stronger and like build up, my mom used to make a joke, like, you're too nice. You're too nice, because she was like, you need to learn how to navigate the world with strength and with that sense of resiliency and so forth. So I think the balance, and what I'm trying to do differently with my son is like help him know his inherent worth and rest, so that it's not connected to labor, although I think that might take a couple more generations to do, and also help him know that he is worthy to be in those spaces and he can go for anything that he wants, knowing that he is going to have to also work twice as hard.
And so what you're raising for me is just this idea that, you have to work twice as hard again to educate your son on how to show up in the world. Like, when are we going to end the cycle where we don't actually have to put forth the labor in sharing these supports and tools and things that our children are going to need? I really do hope that the work that you currently do and that I do and others really does help to change things. Tell us a little bit about your practice. I know you've got an amazing anti-racism course that I would certainly recommend all viewers take a look at selamdebs.com. But talk a little bit about the program and what they might get in terms of anti-racism awareness and education.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Janelle, appreciate that. The anti-racism course, it is like a 6-module course. So I take folks through this journey. It's self-led. They're watching videos of me speaking, and there's workbooks for each module to kind of move through reflection. And basically they move through this journey of unlearning Canada's history, right? Like learning what so-called Canada's history really is, the one that we weren't taught. Understanding how we had 250 years of enslavement of Canada and the genocide of Indigenous peoples and our civil rights movement that's never talked about here and so forth. And then I guide folks through this process of learning about, whiteness and white privilege and the ways in which whiteness shows up in society, so that we're not just learning about Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, but we're also learning about the ways in which white supremacy shows up. And then I guide them through learning about implicit bias, how anti-Black racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, so forth shows up in society. And then systemic racism, how like systems operate within that, right? The housing system, healthcare. And then we move into allyship in the 5th module. And then the last one is how to become an anti-racist. So basically it's kind of like an extensive unlearning process that folks go through.
I'm smiling because it sounds like exactly how I design my anti-racism training to just, I do it in 4 parts, but yeah, the first is all about like, what is racism? What is, systemic racism? How does it show up in the world is the second, how does it present in the world in all the various forms? We talk about, I think, whiteness in the 3rd one, where, we're deconstructing like white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility, like white rage, like all those concepts. Yes. And then the last one to anti-racism and equity. So I know that it's the business. I know that you're doing an awesome job just by the way that you broke that down. So tell us also, you've got an amazing yoga studio. Tell me about, is it Juicy Yoga with an I? Tell us about Juicy Yoga and how does that work together with your anti-racism work?
Yeah, that's how I started my entrepreneur pathways, taking over and buying this studio, which used to be Community of Hearts Yoga. And then I rebranded it, and I did it through going through a divorce, having no capital, nothing to make it happen. And then slowly just built it into this space of like a sanctuary. It's my place. When I walk into this space, all the things kind of go away. But Juicy Yoga is basically, we teach yoga and meditation. We have workshops, we do all of that. And for me, I think, even through the pandemic, folks were saying to me, like, are you going to let go of the studio? And I was like, no way, because I need that to ground me and to anchor me. And I truly believe, what I've come to believe over time is like, as I do this work more, and I feel more tired and I feel more exhausted, that activism and healing must come together. They must be intertwined. And I know you've talked about that, about the ways in which we understand that if we are doing the work of anti-racism, but we are not looking at our own intergenerational healing, our own, well-being and finding ways to create boundaries and space and stillness and, all of those things, and interrupting those cycles, then I think we create more harm, or more harm is perpetuated against us because of the nature of the work. And so for me, I'm starting to more and more like find ways to intertwine the two. The meditation, the yoga, the healing practices, the intergenerational healing, and the work of anti-racism and equity, so that when I'm coming into workspaces, I'm saying to folks, this is a call to your humanity, because let me tell you, racist, oppressive systems, they hurt everybody. No one is thriving in an oppressive system.
That's so true. That is so true, right? We have people at the top and people at the bottom, but even those on the so-called top are not thriving because the system of inequality remains. We all do better when, you know, we can eliminate the imbalances. It's getting people to see that that the inequities and disparities that exist, just they don't need to exist. That we can all be at the, you know, I'm thinking of the coin model of privilege as I say this. We can all be on the, you know, the top side of coins if we learn how to treat people equitably. Salam, I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking and sharing a little bit about yourself. It's a pleasure for me to meet you personally, and you know, a little bit about what you do with Juicy Yoga, juicyyoga.com, with an I for all the viewers, and at salamdebs.com. It's been my absolute pleasure having you. And thank you again for being my guest.
Thank you, Janelle. It's a pleasure.
All right, have a lovely afternoon. And don't forget, for those of you watching, don't forget to click the subscribe button down below. Thank you, and we'll see you for another episode of Twice as Hard next time.